I wanna be a billionaire so freaking bad. Buy all of the things I never had. I wanna be on the cover of Forbes magazine, smiling next to Oprah and the Queen. Oh, every time I close my eyes, I see my name in shiny lights. Yeah, a different city every night. Oh, I swear the world better prepare for when I'm a billionaire.
So today's video is going to focus on the somewhat controversial topic, especially in light of current political events, controversial topic of international trade. And what we're going to focus on is how international trade impacts consumer welfare or consumer and producer surplus. Now, there are kind of three major questions that we're going to seek to answer. First question, what determines if a country will choose to import a good or export a good? So why would a country import a good or export a good? Second, who gains and, importantly, who loses from free trade among countries? And then finally, what are the arguments and the counter arguments that people will choose to use to advocate for trade restrictions? So here we have a market of steel. We have the domestic supply and the domestic demand. So this is a market without international trade. So this is a country, let's say it's isolation land. Country that doesn't engage in any trade whatsoever. They refuse to engage with the outside world. So the equilibrium price and quantity are going to be determined by the domestic supply and the domestic demand, the point where they intersect. Consumer surplus will be the area above equilibrium price and below demand. Producer surplus will be the area above supply and below equilibrium price. Okay? All kind of basic stuff we've looked at. Now let's suppose isolation land chooses to remove trade restrictions. Okay? They're going to do what's called liberalizing trade restrictions. That means it's the idea they're going to become more of a free market and they're going to engage in trade with the rest of the world. And let's further suppose that the world price is greater than the domestic equilibrium price. The world price up here, the world price up here is the price that prevails on the world market. Now, this often happens when products are what's called commodities. A commodity is a product that's pretty much the same no matter where it's produced. Steel is an example of a commodity. Even though there are different types of steel, for our purposes, let's just say steel is a commodity. So this country, the price in the rest of the world is greater than the price they can produce it for. So the question becomes, what's going to happen in this country? So the first thing that's going to happen is if they engage in trade, the price will rise to the world price. Okay, if they engage in trade, the price will rise to the world price. Because of the higher price, the domestic quantity demanded is going to fall. So here was our domestic quantity demanded before trade. Here's our new domestic quantity demanded after trade. However, also because of the price, the domestic quantity supplied is going to increase because domestic suppliers are going to want to make more because they can sell it for a higher price. When the world price is greater than the equilibrium price, the country will wind up exporting the product. They're going to sell the product abroad. Okay, they're going to make it at home, sell it abroad. Now let's look at it from a surplus point of view. Okay, so the blue shaded area would represent consumer surplus before trade. The green shaded area would represent producer surplus before trade. After trade, what's going to happen is consumer surplus is going to decline. Consumer surplus is now going to be equal to just area A. Prior to trade, it had been equal to area A and B. After trade, consumer surplus is just area A because the price has gone up. Producer surplus is going to increase. Producer surplus will now be equal to area B, C, and D. Prior to trade, producer surplus had been just area C at the domestic equilibrium price, but now producer surplus is going to be B, C, and D. And what's going to happen is total surplus is actually going to increase. Before trade, total surplus was A, B, and C. After trade, total surplus is A, B, C, and D. And what happens is area D represents the gains from trade. Okay? This is the increase in surplus that's going to happen as a result of international trade. And the driving force of this, we kind of learned this before in the class when we learned about comparative advantage. The driving force of this gains from trade is specialization, right? Countries are going to specialize in the things that they do best in. This country, because their domestic price for steel is less than the world price, is really good at making steel, and they would benefit by producing more steel. Now, one of the important notes, though, is domestic producers are better off. They're better off by areas B and D. However, it's worth noting there are losers from trade in this scenario. In this scenario, domestic consumers are actually worse off. Now, the gains to producers, surplus areas B and D, are greater than the losses to consumers, area B, but consumers are worse off as a result of this trade. Now, on the other hand, if the world price is less than the equilibrium price, the domestic equilibrium price, that country will end up importing the good, okay, bringing it in from abroad. Because at the low price, domestic producers don't want to sell the product, right? Because the price is going to drop to the world price. However, because of the low price, domestic consumers are going to want to import the product. Okay, so when we look at it from a surplus point of view, here's what it's going to look like. The blue shaded area would represent consumer surplus before trade. The green shaded area would represent producer surplus before trade. After trade, consumer surplus is now area A, B, and D, but producer surplus is just area C. So prior to trade, domestic consumers are going to get area A. After trade, they're going to get area A, B, and D. Prior to trade, domestic producers get area C and B. After trade, they're just going to get area C. So when a country imports the good, consumers gain, producers lose. And consumers are going to benefit by areas B and D, but producers are going to lose by just area B. So the gains to consumers will outweigh the losses to producers. However, it's important to note, as I said, when we export a good, there are losers. Okay, this is why trade policy can be so contentious, why there can be such a dispute over trade. If you look at the current political arguments, you hear a lot about this. Some people are worse off as a result of trade. Now, what will often happen, especially when a country is importing a good, Now, what will often happen, especially when a country is importing a good, is policymakers under pressure from either domestic producers, manufacturers, people who are involved in the production of the good, will respond by trying to limit trade with that good. So like, let's say, for example, cars in the United States in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the United States experienced increasing competition with foreign auto producers importing foreign-produced cars into the United States. Many domestic auto producers responded by calling for the placement of a tariff or a tax on imported cars. Okay? So what the effect of a tariff is it's going to be to raise the world price. Okay, it's going to increase the world price closer to the domestic equilibrium price. So when we look at it from a surplus point of view, here's what it's going to look like. Prior to the tariff, okay, without the tariff in place, because the world price is so low relative to the domestic price, producers are going to want to produce QS1, consumers are going to want to purchase QD1, and they're going to import this quantity. The tariff is in effect going to raise the world price by the size of the tariff. Let's say it's I don't know, a $2 a pound tariff on steel. It's going to raise the price by $2 a pound. Okay? So it's going to raise the price closer to the domestic equilibrium price. Because of the tariff, domestic producers are going to want to produce more. The price has gone up. At the same time, domestic consumers are going to want to consume less, okay, because the price is higher. And when we look at it from a surplus point of view, here's what it's going to look like. So prior to the tariff, consumer surplus would be area A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay? Producer surplus is going to be area G. After the tariff is imposed, consumer surplus will be areas A and area B. Okay? The area above price and below demand. Producer surplus is going to be area C and G. So as a result of the tariff, producers are going to gain area C. Okay? Area E is going to represent tax revenue. So if you think about it, a tariff is a tax. This is the height of the tax. This would be the quantity imported after the tax. That's the quantity they're going to pay the tax on. This area would equal tax revenue. Area D and area F are going to be deadweight loss. Okay? These are transactions that don't take place because of the tariff, right? Classic definition of deadweight loss. These are the transactions that are not happening because of the tariff. Now, for every tariff, there is also a complementary import quota that would have the same impact. Okay? So an import quota is similar to a tariff in that it's a restriction on trade. The difference is, rather than trying to actually raise the revenue itself, okay, through unlimited trade, you can bring in as many as you want as long as you pay the tariff. What the government will do is they will sell licenses to import the goods. So they'll allow a limited quantity of goods from abroad to be imported. Okay? And the idea is the government will then auction the right to import the good to the highest bidder. Okay? And the welfare impact, the impact on consumer and producer surplus, should be comparable. Okay? So after the import quota, consumer surplus is area A and B. Producer surplus is area C and G. Government revenue is going to be the number of tariffs sold, number of quotas sold, should be right here. Okay, the number imported, times the price of the license, right here, and this would represent government revenue. Area D and F would represent deadweight loss. Now, the issue with import quotas, area E, is supposed to equal the tax revenue, or the revenue from the quota. The big issue becomes with quotas is that oftentimes the quotas aren't sold for full market value. So what happens is, in a lot of corrupt nations, they'll put in place import quotas, and political leaders, family members, people who are willing to bribe government officials, whatever, okay, will end up being the ones who get the license to import the product. And because of the high level of corruption involved with import quotas, generally speaking, economists tend to prefer tariffs. It's a simpler form of collecting revenue, and it's less susceptible to government corruption. Import quotas are much more susceptible to high levels of government corruption. Now, the lessons of trade policy, okay? So if, and notice, it's a big if, okay? So if government sells import licenses for full value, the revenue would equal that of a tariff, and the result of a tariff and a quota are identical. But again, it's a big if, okay? Oftentimes, governments don't end up selling the licenses for full market value. They end up going to political contributors, family members, actually often the government officials themselves through proxy corporations. All kinds of potential corruption is involved with import quotas. Now, what are the lessons from trade policy? Both tariffs and quotas raise the price of the good. Okay, they increase the price of the good. They make domestic consumers worse off by raising the price, and they make domestic producers better off. And because both tariffs and quotas are a form of a tax, they always are going to cause dead weight loss. Okay, they're always going to cause dead weight loss. Now, because of this dead weight loss, most economists, now I say most, not all, most economists, generally speaking, will favor free trade policies. Okay. Now, there are a lot of caveats that can be added to that. The idea is the gains of the winners should be used to offset the losses to the losers. This does not always happen, which is why some economists of late, some notable economists lately, have become a little more lukewarm in their praise for free trade. Now, other benefits of international trade: you get increased variety of goods, you get lower costs through economies of scale. There's a process known as amalgamation. Amalgamation will often, and I'm not sure how to spell this, amalgamation, where production gets centered in a specific area. Detroit is a great example of amalgamation. Okay, the production of automobiles and automobile parts locating in Detroit in the early 20th century, okay, will lower costs for everyone. Today, you see some benefits of amalgamation happening in cities like Shenzhen, China, where electronics are produced. Okay, another benefit is you get increased competition. I would argue that the auto industry has been a beneficiary of increased competition in that the competition has improved quality. Now, there have been some domestic auto producers who have been driven out of the industry, but those were often the least competitive auto companies out there. So having them driven out of the industry is not always a bad thing. And finally, we have the enhanced flow of ideas. This is the notion of synergy. Synergy is the idea that you're going to bring kind of unrelated ideas together to create something new. And we'll talk a little bit about synergy in class. Now, what are the arguments for restricting trade? Okay, why would some people choose to argue to restrict trade? I'm going to go through these very quickly, and I will kind of give you a little bit more information about these 5 arguments in class. And I would highly recommend you read this section of your textbook, because there will be some questions about this. So the first argument is the jobs argument. That's the argument that foreign producers are reducing domestic jobs. So when we import products from abroad, that costs American companies domestic jobs. The counter argument to the jobs argument is that, yes, foreign trade destroys jobs. However, foreign trade in other areas creates jobs. So a great example of this, again, is the auto industry. Certainly, foreign trade has destroyed automobile producing jobs in the United States. However, at the same time, because we're allowed to trade in high technology with foreign countries, other jobs producing computers and software and designing IT programs are being created elsewhere in the economy. The second argument is the national security argument. This is the argument that we don't want foreign producers to produce products that are vital to our national security. The counter argument to this is that there are very, very few products that are actually vital to our national security. Certainly, we don't want foreign producers producing classified or top secret products, but at the same time, there are very few of those out there. So if we were to put in place widespread trade restrictions, it really wouldn't benefit our national security all that much. Next, we have the infant industry argument. This is the argument that trade protection should be put in place until companies can become more competitive. So if we have companies that are just starting out, they're just starting to engage in trade, if we force them to engage in trade with the rest of the world, they'll be driven out of business and they'll never get to fully develop. And the infant industry argument continues: once those companies have fully developed, we can remove the trade restrictions. The counter argument to the infant industry argument is that the trade restrictions are almost never removed. Companies don't ever want to have their trade restrictions removed. Next, we have the unfair competition argument. This is the argument that foreign producers are dumping products on American shores, so they're selling them for below market cost to gain market share. They're taking advantage of lax environmental regulations. They don't have workers' protections. Any litany of things that's wrong in foreign countries. Therefore, we shouldn't trade with them. Otherwise, American companies will start to have similar practices. The counter argument to the unfair competition argument is that the gains to the consumers still outweigh the losses to the producers. Okay, so overall surplus is still going to increase. Now, the final argument is the protection as a bargaining chip argument. This is kind of the North Korea / Iran argument. Okay, so we should restrict trade until the country does what we want it to do. Cuba is another great example, right? So Cuba had a communist revolution in 1959. The United States has been embargoing trade with, had been embargoing trade with Cuba since about 1963, okay, in an effort to kind of force Cuba to make concessions towards free trade and towards liberalizing their economy. The problem with the protection as a bargaining chip argument, the counter argument to the protection as a bargaining chip argument, is that it's ineffective. When we look at countries we've tried to use trade restrictions on to get our way, they rarely work, especially when we do it on our own. Now, if the world does it in conjunction with other countries, if the United States does it in conjunction with the rest of the world, it may be slightly more effective. But when we tend to go it alone, it's usually pretty ineffective. Now, when it comes to trade, there are two basic approaches countries can do. The first is unilateral. So countries might choose to unilaterally lower trade restrictions. That's do it on their own. Okay, this is often pretty unpopular. The United States does not often unilaterally remove trade restrictions. What we tend to focus on is multilateral trade agreements, where we reduce trade barriers in conjunction with other countries. And there are a couple of prominent examples of multilateral trade restrictions I'm going to talk about. So there are two kind of basic case studies I'm going to talk about. The first is GATT. GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. GATT was an agreement of the Western powers coming out of World War II that significantly reduced trade restrictions from about 40% at the end of World War II. So what happened is during the Great Depression, the United States and much of the developed Western world engaged in a trade war after the United States imposed a unilateral tariff on imported goods under what's called the Hawley-Smoot tariff. So it reduced tariffs from about 40% to about 5% today. Now, in 1999, GATT was replaced with what's called the WTO, and that's the World Trade Organization, which is responsible for enforcing kind of the worldwide trade regime, for lack of a better word. We'll talk more about the WTO in class. The second trade agreement, probably one of the largest trade agreements, is NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA was signed in 1993, and it reduced trade barriers between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Today, essentially, the United States, Mexico, and Canada is a free trade zone. And there's one final kind of trade agreement that's really important that I didn't include on here, but we're going to talk about a little bit in class, and that is the Eurozone. Okay, the Eurozone took GATT, created a common market in Europe, and developed a common currency called the euro. We'll talk a little bit more about the euro in class later this week.